is not. Test.
Are we live? Yeah, my bad.
That's good. Just recognizing.
Oh, I just hit my desk and I heard the mic thing. Hearing everything 3 times now. All right. Testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Testing Twitch 1 2 3 1 2 3.
Oh, pause the stream. So I'm muting it. Okay. Yeah, I think we're good. Oh shit.
What?
No, I was doing the tweet and why does the link look weird? I don't know. I'm just doing the tweet. Doesn't matter.
Okay. You ready to get started?
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to episode 179 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are going to continue covering this major four of the 2025 CDL season. We talked about it originally over the midweek, I think. We talked about it, I think, on Wednesday. And we're back to talk about it a little bit more. And today, I think we're going to talk a lot about OpTic. We didn't really get to that point in the show earlier in the week, but I would really like to talk about OpTic because this was certainly one of the most promising performances that they've had all of this season. We also have to talk about the Miami Heretics and what they've been able to do, especially over these last few months. And I would really like to also talk about the Vancouver Surge for all those reasons not, because they did not have the type of performance that we certainly expected and the type of performances that OpTic and Miami had. So I think we'll have a lot to talk about, maybe some other stuff throughout the show. But before we get to any of that, how you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Not a great day in real sports land for New York fans or Knick fans, but yeah, like you said, we spent a good amount of time last episode talking about Elliot and Tatch and then LAT and Phase for Major Four, and obviously leaves the door open for us to talk about a bunch of other teams today. So I'm ready to dive right in.
Yeah, I don't know who the Indiana Pacers equivalent would be in the CDL. Maybe Miami. I don't know. Like that's like we don't really have like the small market, big market thing because pretty much everybody is in located in like the Dallas Fort Worth area, and those teams don't really matter all that much. But I do think that we have seen, not necessarily at the top in the CDL, but we have seen a lot of parity, especially in the top four. It doesn't seem to be a consistent top four, and that's kind of how we got there at Major Four. OpTic Texas, who has had pretty much the worst LAN performances that I can remember from an OpTic team consistently, maybe since World War II. Obviously, the top 32 team or top 24 team at Champs is kind of at the forefront of my mind. But other than that, OpTic has been by and large very consistent on LAN. Certainly, usually a contender at these LAN events, and that has not been the case so far this season. And it kind of all changed at Major Four. Certainly, maybe not. We've talked about it before. OpTic fans, at least some of them, have the mentality: if you're not first, you're last. So certainly, if they believe that, then they came in last again at Major Four. But this was a great performance. Certainly, especially considering Mercules has not had many of these events under his belt. He was at Major 3 with the Toronto Ultra, and he performed even better than anyone could ever imagine from him in that scenario. This time he comes in with a few weeks practice, a few weeks of Major 4 qualifying matches with OpTic, and they're able to get a top 4 finish. And honestly, like, you could argue that they were like, you know, just because they finished fourth didn't mean that they were the fourth best team. They could have been argued as the third best team, considering the teams that they lost to. They had a very hard schedule ahead of them. I'd like to get your thoughts on OpTic and how they performed. And really, the one part I want to hone in on is OpTic a contender now that they've had a few weeks with Mercules. They're going to have, double that in terms of practice over the next month or so before champs. Where do you see OpTic in terms of contender status now that they've had a pretty good land performance under their belt?
I do think that, kind of just circling back with how you started this, talking about the top 4 in general, I don't think that's real. I mean, you can be nitpicky with a bunch of it, but like really, I mean, the top 2 isn't changing, even though Vancouver Surge has been in 2 grand finals. I still think the top 2 teams are FaZe and LAT because they're the teams with 2 championships, right? So after them, I guess you can do, if you're doing a top 4, you can argue Miami, Vancouver before Major 4, obviously, and now Toronto and OpTic. And OpTic, I mean, heading into Major 4, the big, I don't know if that was necessarily big, but like my focus and narrative wise for them was, they have the 3 top 8 finishes before this event. They needed to, they were in a decent spot for champs qualification wise for CDL points, but getting a first round win basically like clinched it for them, barring like a wild, first or second place finish run from Minnesota and or C9. Um, so heading into their first round match here at Major 4, it was a rematch of that qualifier match we saw the week before, which feels like ancient history now. But
Yeah,
I forget the exact team. They Boston or OpTic lost to Boston and LAG, I believe, in the qualifiers. They beat Carolina and Toronto, I think, with Mercules. So it was, I just remember my like thought process and way I was describing it was like, if they were playing any other team heading into Major 4, I really wasn't sure who I was going to pick, whether OpTic or their opponent. But because I literally just saw them beat Toronto, I couldn't go against them. And to play devil's advocate there too, you could say like, it's a land matchup, and we don't necessarily know if something was going on with Toronto online. Obviously we didn't hear anything, but that has been a thing throughout the year, not to discredit OpTic anyway or anything, but there was like, you could look at it from another perspective there with if you were wanting to pick Toronto in that matchup. And the fact that OpTic got a win over Toronto kind of in my eyes, like, showed that it wasn't necessarily a fluke in the online matchup. They did it back-to-back matches. And most importantly, that was just a big win, because the worst possible thing for OpTic would have been losing that match to a team they had just beat and then dropping down to losers bracket with the uncertainty of their champ's fate still in the balance, right? Like they drop down to losers bracket, they lose whoever they play down there, and then they're sitting there watching the whole event, just like worried about, are we going to actually be a champs or not. So I think in the grand scheme of things, that was a really important match for OpTic. They got to play against Toronto, a team they'd already beaten, and they did it again. So that, in my eyes, circling back, this is like a long-winded circle for me, but circling back to our OpTic contenders right now, like if you viewed Toronto as contenders at any point this year, the fact OpTic now beat them twice, like that has to at least like put them in the conversation in my eyes. How highly you rank them though, just given the way we've seen LAT and Atlanta play, and even Miami. And now, full circle here, what I was trying to get to was OpTic in general at this event. They get a 4th place finish, but they only play 4 matches. They go 2-2, and they beat they beat Toronto, and Minnesota, and they lose to FaZe and LAT. So that has to factor into the contender conversation too, with their 2 losses being against those, the quote unquote top 2 teams for most of this season. So, it would have been like a crazy, it would have been a really cool talking point, and the green wall would have been going nuts if OpTic beat either LAT or Atlanta in their first event with Mercules. Like, that would have just been, the green wall would have been going nuts, and we would have had a totally different talking point here. But I think that's just a holistic way of looking at their run at the major. They took care of business in terms of the champs qualification. Got their best placing of the year with the new kid, which, side note here too, it's technically Mercury's worst placing in the CDL, which is kind of funny, but that's not a very serious comment, even though it's factually correct. But they have the momentum in my eyes, I think, going into champs, just in the sense of their losses were to teams that they probably weren't going to beat. I remember they beat LAT early in the year when Kenny had the 1v2 on Hacienda Surge Game 5, Round 11. But outside of that, I don't know how many wins they have against LAT or Atlanta this year. So just, I do think, 4th place is a obviously good spot to be in for OpTic. It got them that champ spot. It was their best placing so far this year. I think realistically speaking, just based on what's happened this year, it's very possible OpTic, might not get a top 4 finish at champs. But at the same time, just based on especially Vancouver at this last event, we don't know. They're kind of a wild card now heading into champs. And Miami's been playing very well as well. It's possible that just like mathematically speaking, the top 4 is most likely Atlanta, LA Thieves, barring some wild upsets that, it happened last year at champs, so it could happen again. But LAT, Atlanta, and then 2 of Miami, Vancouver, OpTic, and Toronto. Based on OpTic's performances against Toronto, I would put Toronto towards the end, but then at the same time, Vancouver with a top 12 finish we'll talk about later. Where you want to put them, you could see, OpTic maybe 4th place is like what you can set the bar at for expectations going into champs.
So OpTic is 0-4 against FaZe this season, and they are 1-2 against LAT. They won that first match against the Thieves this season, which was back in January, I want to say. Yeah, January 19th, Game 5. And they played again in March, and then obviously this time around at Major 4. So, they haven't really had a ton of experience against this current Thieves roster. FaZe, we've talked about it before. Draza is kind of like anti-OpTic. He's basically the boogeyman. It's been bad, and OpTic fans have not reacted to it well, especially with this most recent loss. But I think for OpTic, it is encouraging at the very least to actually have some kind of momentum coming out of a LAN event. It feels like it has been the complete opposite for every other major so far this season. Of course, that Major 1 was demoralizing and in many ways kind of ruined their season because they had 6-1 record in the qualifiers. They looked really, really strong. Then they go to the major, and I think they get top, and everything kind of spirals from there. They bring back Pred, and they just never kind of get their footing until most recently. And even then, coming into this event, we talked about it. They hadn't been able to string 2 wins together in a row. Unfortunately, they did that. They beat Toronto online, and then they beat Toronto on land. So that's 2 wins in a row. And then they lost the FaZe, beat Minnesota, and lost. So they're back to the 1-1-1. But I think that's pretty understandable results, all things considered, when you're playing Atlanta and LAT, the 2 best teams by far in the league. And to answer my own question about whether OpTic are contenders, I've said this so many times this season. and usually I don't have to say it because usually OpTic is very good and they are always kind of considered contenders, even if they're not maybe performing up to standard at that moment. This season has been completely different. They were at risk of not even making champs
Yeah.
coming into last week. So like that's not a scenario where you can say, well, yeah, they're just kind of in a slump. Like, no, this was the entire season essentially where they were not competitive against any of these top teams, and even some of the worst teams. Granted, they're the only team, unless things changed at Major Four, and I don't remember, but I think they were the only team to lose to Vegas and LAG all season. I don't think there was another team to, even with Major Four. So that kind of proves how bad and how up and down OpTic, or mostly down OpTic was this season. Um, but I've said it multiple times that I just can never count OpTic out because they have so much talent, and I've seen them in the past have just horrible performances online, and then they come to LAN and they're ready to go. And then sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes on LAN they just kind of stink, and then they go back to online and they're back to the form that I expected them to. So I would say they're a contender because I can't count them out. I have more, I guess, more faith in OpTic to win champs than I do the Toronto Ultra, for example. Even though Toronto has been way more consistent, has been in general a better team, but I don't have the belief that they can like rise to that next level and beat specifically LAT and Atlanta. And we really haven't seen that all that much. Granted they're 1-6 against those teams. I'm saying about OpTic, but at the same point, I believe that Mercules is the kind of talent that could beat those teams. I think in general, OpTic has the talent to beat those teams. It's just kind of, will they be able to do it when it comes down to it? And they're going to have to right away have a very strong performance at champs, or they're going to have that long losers bracket run to even make it to that point.
Well, I was just gonna say too. I think really my initial answer there was like not actually factoring in the champs bracket,
Yeah,
which we
yeah.
obviously already know, and their first round matchup is against FaZe. So that's a really an incredibly tough first round matchup. Just and that's the byproduct of the season OpTics had, and they put themselves with their backs against the wall just due to their early season performances. But I think, if you aren't like thinking ahead like that, if you're just thinking like right now without looking at the actual matchups, like can OpTic win champs? Um, I think they got a shot, but obviously it's, like we've outlined it pretty well for the last, there's some teams you'd put above them. Um, that you'd probably feel a little more confident in to win champs. At the same time, though, just as a reminder, a year ago we were in this position. Our OpTic came in dead last at the final major before champs last season, and then they win champs. So you never really know with OpTic. I think it's kind of been proven at this point that last major of the regular season last year was more of a fluke, obviously just because they did you know win it all at champs. Um, but now it is a little different because they're technically coming into champs this year with their best placing of the year, as opposed to last year going into champs with their worst placing of the year. Um, at the same time, though, contender status or not, the important thing for OpTic, I think, over these next couple weeks is they're just going to get more reps in with Mercules, which young kid uh, hasn't been playing, you know, a ton of competitive or respawn over the years, and let alone only been playing a couple weeks with this actual roster. If they put some good work in, this team could get better, and that is a scary thought for a lot of these teams, especially just the way Mercules is played individually. And to their credit too, even a guy like Hook, who kind of is getting lost in all this, at one point earlier in the season was probably considered the best player on OpTic, and he played pretty well at this major for what I saw. Um, but end of the day, I think OpTic they showed the potential at this major, just that they can make something happen, but still with two losses against those quote unquote top two, it's going to be tough to really say, yeah, OpTic is winning champs right now.
It's kind of remarkable and I credit this almost exclusively to Mercules because I think very highly of Hook and Ashi and Shotzi. I think they're all great players in their own right. Yet when was with this team, I think you and I both were of the same mind that this team just does not have the championship material. They are not that close to, like we wouldn't even be considering what we're considering now of like, I mean, maybe, like they obviously have to beat FaZe. They have to probably beat LAT to get to the championship. At that point, they were losing to Vegas. They were, 1-4, 1-5 in these qualifiers. They look like one of the worst teams in the league. And I think the fact that they are where they are now, and I would say they're probably in the top half. I don't know, like if you look at betting odds or like how you would consider like most likely to win champs, but I would consider them to be in the top half of the 8-team field, which is not where they were at all a month ago or month and a half ago. And I think that's a lot to do with Mercules and kind of what and how highly people think of him, and I think rightfully so, in how highly they think. But I did want to talk about that OpTic FaZe matchup because we saw it at Major Four, and while OpTic did lose again, I think I said it was their fourth consecutive loss this season. I don't know total what the record is because
Yeah.
for a while, or I think for maybe a year or so, OpTic was in control of the rivalry. They were very, very good. And over the last 2 years, maybe even 3, I can't exactly remember, but we know what draws at least. It has been very heavily in favor of FaZe. And this match, again, went to FaZe 3-1. FaZe wins hardpoint, the search, and the second hardpoint. That being said, this was about as close of a series as it could get, especially in those first 2 maps. FaZe wins 250 to 246 on Rewind Hardpoint. 4 points is, one of the closest hardpoint maps we've seen this season. I think we just saw 250 to 249, either this weekend or last week. And then it was a round 11 protocol search and destroy win. Again, like I think championship teams win these maps more often than not, and they're able to pull out wins even against teams that they maybe people would consider inferior. And I think a lot of people coming into this match thought OpTic is inferior to FaZe. And yet OpTic made a match out of it. And we just talked about like how little practice or relatively little practice they've had with Mercules, only 3 or 4 weeks heading into the FaZe has been together for the better part of 2 years now, like almost 2 full seasons. And yet OpTic almost pulled off this win. So I think that is a positive and encouraging sign for OpTic. I think they can beat FaZe. If we're just looking at talent, OpTic is very talented. FaZe is very talented. I would not give either team edge in terms of talent, or like if I did give an edge, I don't think it is significant. So I think OpTic has the chance, and that's what I'm opening the door to. Is it is not a guarantee in the first round at champs that OpTic is just going to lose and lay down against FaZe, even though the past has kind of dictated that has happened. Like I would imagine they're 1-9 or something over these last 2 seasons, and that's not great history, but we've seen at champs that some of that history usually does not actually matter. Comes down to.
And there was I'm trying to find it too because I thought it was 2 back to back. Maybe it was at Major 3 and then at or I'm looking at the Major 3 qualifiers right now, so maybe they played at Major 3. Oh, that's what I'm looking at. They 3-0'd them at the Major, and then yeah, so they played back to back. Basically, they played on April 20th and April 25th, OpTic in Atlanta, and OpTic beat them on Hacienda Hardpoint 250 to 143. Notably, this was during Atlanta's like remarkable hardpoint struggles that were very noteworthy. and then there's another 6-5 search in the game 2, and then the game 4, Atlanta wins 250 to 244 on vault hardpoint. So that's another like very close series. It's a 3-1 win for Atlanta, but it's kind of deceiving just if you look at the um, actual maps. And then even at Major 3 itself, there's another 6-5 search and destroy map 2 and a 3-2 in the control. This time, though, Hacienda Hardpoint goes to phase 250 to 161. So even though phase is winning these matches 3-0, 3-1, there are a lot of close individual maps. And we talk about it. I forget the exact examples, but I always think about it in terms of like football when, um, like uh, division opponents play each other twice in the regular season and they match up in the playoffs, and one team's 2-0 heading into that. I always say it's really hard to beat a team 3 times in the same season. And in terms of football stuff, this is at this point like it's got to be like, FaZe has got to be confident going into the match, but at the same time, there are a lot of close individual maps, despite what the actual series scores may indicate if you don't take a little closer look.
I just looked it up, and OpTic over these last 2 seasons, all with Draza, OpTic is 1-11. Their one win is March 12th at Major 3. I think the loser, last year, losers finals, I believe. OpTic won that match, and so, but yeah, that is the only win over these last 2 years. But again, like it's really, it's relevant. These stats are relevant until they're not, right?
Yep.
If you think about the NFL, Josh Allen has lost to Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs however many times in the playoffs. That's all relevant until the Bills beat the Chiefs in the playoffs. And then people are like, it's over. Mahomes can't beat Josh Allen and so on and so forth. And I think that's what we'll be saying about OpTic if they're able to beat FaZe. And I'm still going to pick FaZe. I'm just, I'm going to say a month in advance, I'm going to pick FaZe in that first round matchup at Champs during the pick'em. And I know you are too. Yep. At the same point, I don't think that this is a bygone or a foregone conclusion that OpTic is gonna just completely just collapse against FaZe. I think it'll be really competitive, and these are different teams. FaZe has at times looked a little weird. Obviously, on LAN they've been pretty consistent. Aside from Major 3, they were not very good, but for 3/4 of the year in terms of LAN, for most of the, I can't say most of the online qualifiers, but I guess online qualifiers don't really matter anymore. But they've looked weird at times, and they haven't looked great. And then they've looked like the best team in the world. OpTic certainly has not had the ladder, but they are looking better and better with Mercury. I think that will probably continue. Let's talk about Miami real quick, because they are a team that they've gotten so much love on this podcast. We should start a Spanish language podcast to really just reach all of our fans. They finished third at Major 4. I believe they finished third at Major 1, if I'm not mistaken, as well. The 2 top 3 finishes this season on LAN. They end up finishing really, really high in the standings, like the season standings, especially considering where we thought they would end up. They get 5th place in the standings. They jump Carolina, and honestly, that 5th place spot is looking pretty good. Vancouver kind of keep the way that they're playing, but Miami, they, especially that LAT match, that was like the one where I was kind of taken back by it, because I fully expected LAT not to roll over Miami, because Miami's been very good in search. So I thought it would probably be a 3-1 win for the Thieves. And it just didn't really end up mattering all that much, because LAT wins the first search and Miami wins both hard points in the series, which is just baffling to me that could even happen to the Thieves, who are, I believe, statistically the best hard point team, certainly one of the strongest hard point teams just in general, like regardless of the matchup. but Miami wins map 1, map 4, and map 5 in 6-2 Hacienda Surge to advance to the winners. I just, like I said, I was stunned by that result. Of course, afterward we get the, like, I don't know, aches and nade shot kind of. It wasn't like that dramatic, but it was like, oh, that's kind of weird. I haven't seen this happen in a while. Scrap
Yeah.
and Super go face to face. I don't know exactly what was said. I don't know if it was just Scrap got pissed that Super maybe was talking a little bit of shit after the win. Obviously, Scrap got the final laugh. He got in Super's face a little bit after LAT eliminated Miami later in the tournament. But either way, Miami finishing top 3 again. What about their contender status? Is that something that, to me, it seems a bridge too far, right? I'm hesitant to say anybody outside of FaZe, LAT are true contenders. Vancouver, we'll talk about them. Before this tournament, I thought they were true contenders.
Yeah.
Anybody else kind of seems like that's maybe a little too early. But Miami, they've actually had these performances. They beat LAT. They're one of the few teams to do so. Does that change how you view Miami in terms of, actually contending for champs?
It does, and that's really, if you didn't say that, that would have been my answer here. Is just like the fact that I think is really, maybe it might have been at, no, Major 2 Miami struggled, so maybe it was Major 1 and Major 3. I'm pretty sure at 2 majors this year though, LAT like 3-0 smoked Miami in less than 30 minutes. Um, I feel like it definitely happened at Major 3, and I feel like it happened at another event too, but just off the top of my head, like I don't know exactly, but there have been some lopsided matches in that series until these qualifiers, and Miami beat LAT in the Major 4 qualifiers too, and that was kind of like, a little bit of an eye opener because that's LAT and Vancouver both started 0-2. Schedule wise, they had some tough matchups in there, but nonetheless, neither of us were expecting that. At the start of the Major 4 qualifiers, where literally Vancouver and LAT had just played in the grand finals of Major 3, right? So, that was a little fishy. And then the fact that, similar to this, the OpTic and Toronto conversation we were just having, the fact that Miami's able to do it again on LAN and beat LAT on LAN again at this event, that's where, at least, not even like, based on the way Miami's been playing lately, I definitely think they're a better team than OpTic, but like in terms of like ranking contenders or whatever, this whole narrative we've had for this show so far, OpTic not having that win over a FaZe or an LAT recently, whereas Miami does have that win over LAT recently, that like, pushes them up a little bit further or closer, I guess, to those top 2 in my eyes. And, for me personally, like, we talk about it over the years, just that S&D, it speaks to me. And when a team is as good at S&D as Miami has shown since Super's been fully integrated into the roster, that's always gonna, have me feel in some sort of way heading into a tournament as big as champs, where, if it comes down to a game 7 search, and Miami is playing, a team that's not FaZe or LAT in the finals, like, I'm probably going to lean Miami just because of the search and the way we've seen them perform in that mode so far since Super joined the team on a full-time basis. So, really, overall for Miami, like you said, we have sung their praises over the last couple months since Super's been added to the team. Don't have to, sound like a broken record here, but I do think that, that whole, I guess, for lack of a better term, the saga there at Major 4 with Miami beating LAT and then LAT beating Miami, that is like you know, in terms of the trash talk and stuff, that's really cool and sets up a narrative for a potential rematch at champs. And if we get that dynamic that we saw last year of like the teams facing each other, like there could be some cool clips out of that too. But just in terms of like pure gameplay too, like the fact that these teams have had some very tough matchups recently, and it hasn't been one-sided end result like we were talking about with Atlanta and OpTic. Like they've had some close maps, but FaZe have won all the series in terms of Miami and LAT. At least Miami has a couple of series wins to show for it too over the last couple of weeks. Um, I think that makes Miami a little bit of a potentially a scary team for really. I mean, they beat LAT, so you can't say they aren't a scary team for them. But I guess just in general, they're a team that heading into the season, if we were having this conversation, 6-7 months ago, and we're saying Miami is going to be a scary team heading into champs, we're probably like
No chance.
laughing it off. But yeah, so it's not that seems to be and I had this conversation on this when Heretics fully entered the CDL, bringing up sort of that similar narrative to when they qualified for the CWL, and like people weren't taking them seriously and they were able to go on these runs. It wasn't resulting in championships, but they were causing some upsets and making some stuff happen. That seems to be similar to where they are right now, but they're even better just because they're getting to the championship Sundays. They just haven't made it to the finals yet, but it feels like they could be getting closer. And if I had to pick one team right now that I'm for lack of a better way to describe it, like LAT last year, where they go on these runs at the most important tournaments of the year and they get third at champs and second at EWC.
Mm-hmm.
I believe. I think I said that right.
Yeah, I think so.
That's like, for lack of a better way to describe it, maybe that's where Miami, like a team that hasn't been in the finals this year that could do some damage at champs and EWC. Miami is like probably at the top of the list for me right now.
Yeah, I think that is a good shout with LAT last season, where they were just unexpected. I think we always kind of thought, they're not on that level. They're not on, OpTic's level. They're not on LAT's level, or not LAT, FaZe's level. Like they're not a championship contender, but they're able to get there or get close to there. And I was just looking it up while you're talking. Before Major 4, LAT and Miami actually have played at every single major so far this season. And LAT before Major 4 had won every single matchup. I believe Major 1, they beat them, I think, twice, if I'm not mistaken. I think they won in the winners bracket and then eliminated them in losers finals to advance the grand finals to play FaZe, which is exactly how it worked out this time again. Major 2, I believe Miami started in the losers bracket, and that's when Boston beat LAT, and LAT dropped down to, I think, absolutely brutalize the Heretics. And shortly thereafter, we saw Super come into the lineup, and it's kind of been different. Miami did lose to them in Major 3, if I'm not mistaken, again. And then, of course, Major 4, they face each other twice in the winners bracket and again in the losers finals, with Miami actually picking up that win. And I thought this win, granted they did lose again, and whatever the record is, I'm sure it's not great. Like even on land, like it's whatever 1-5 now. So obviously that's not great in terms of Miami. At that same point, they have one win over the Thieves on land. This is a team that has been to 3 grand finals and won 2 of them. So I think that's pretty good. They've also beaten Atlanta FaZe on land. They beat them. They eliminated them from Major 3 in the losers bracket. They won Game 5. They knocked them out, I think, in losers quarterfinals, I want to say. Again, FaZe has been to 3 grand finals, and they've won 2 of them. So they have wins over both of these top 2 teams on land. I don't think anybody else can say that, because Vancouver, they've beaten FaZe on land, but I don't believe they've beaten LAT. I mean, LAT and FaZe have beaten each other once on land at least, so there's that. But yeah, I don't think maybe the Boston breach. I don't know, like Boston beat LAT, but it feels like something Boston might have been able to pull off. I don't remember Boston beating Atlanta, but
No.
it might have happened at some point this season. But the point is, Miami has been in positions that not many, if any, teams have been in this season. So it would be foolish, I think, of either of us or anybody in the community to underestimate what they're able to do at champs. Again, I'm not going to pick them over FaZe, over LAT. I think those two teams are above the rest. But Miami has as good of a shot as anybody else. And if FaZe has the performance they did at Major 3, where they lose in round 1 and then they kind of have to fight back through the losers bracket, Miami is a great pick to make it to grand finals at that point, which would be astounding. Like that would kind of be historic for them because I don't know, like an all Spanish team making it to champs grand finals. And obviously this is a long shot. I'm just kind of wish casting, I guess, at this point, but that would be pretty historic. It would be a huge moment for the organization, obviously, and it would be proof of concept like nothing else they've seen before. It would be something that Vegas Falcons could only dream of doing, and having this roster of all Saudi players make it that far in the championship tournament. So Miami has, to this point, surprised a lot of people, and I'm not going to let myself be too surprised if they have another great performance at champs. So I would say they're not in the top contenders, but they are right below those top two teams. Like they are probably the third or fourth best team in the game, and that is an incredible thing to accomplish for a team we did not have very high expectations going into this season. Let's talk about Vancouver, though, because they're like the complete opposite. Like we didn't have high expectations either for them coming into this season, but we got our expectations really, really, really high over the past 2 or 3 months. And post Neptune, they were a revelation. They went to 2 grand finals of the majors. They went to the minor grand finals. They beat FaZe multiple times. They gave LIT everything they could handle on a few occasions. And they look like a true contender until this weekend. This was an abomination, I would say. Of course, their winner's bracket match is like, all right, like that's a tough matchup to have against LIT round 1. Yeah. I get that. I did not expect them to win by any means. At that same point, though, you cannot lose to LAT 3-0 and then go down to the losers bracket and lose to the Vegas Falcons. I don't care if OpTic has lost to the Vegas Falcons. I don't care who has lost to the Vegas Falcons this season. You are a team that was widely considered to be the third best team in the CDL and a Grand Finals Championship Sunday contender. You cannot lose to the last place team in the league in the final major. They lose Game 5 to Vegas. They get knocked out top 12 finish along with Boston, C9, and Carolina. 3 teams I do not want to be associated with on a consistent basis. Where do you see Vancouver now that this happened at the last major of the season?
A crazy thing about that statement you just made is 3 of those teams that got 12 at Major 4 are actually qualified for champs.
Yeah.
Obviously, last season, OpTic gets top 12, and then they were still in champs, but I would have to go back and look to see how many times that's been the case where multiple teams that qualified for champs come in last at the final regular season major.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But regardless of all that, I just think that's like, overall for Vancouver, I have a pretty similar outlook on the tournament as you. Like that first round matchup against LAT, that was always going to be a tough matchup for them. We went in depth on the preview show about it. They've struggled this season, even with Neptune in the lineup. Whether it's a best of 7 or a best of 5, they've struggled against LAT. So wasn't expecting them to really come out on top in the winners bracket, but I did say, like, because of that first round matchup in the losers bracket with Vancouver, and I believe, if they won that match against, or sorry, I think I said Vancouver, the first round loser bracket matchup against Vegas, because of the bracket, the way the loser bracket shook out. I said like even if Vancouver lose to Thieves and winners bracket, they drop down, they have a good chance to go on a long loser bracket run because of the way the bracket uh, played out. And that's just not the case. And I think that's just really like the loss to Vegas. I believe this is their only win on land of the year. Um, that's just for a team that's been in two grand finals of the past two events before this one. Really, just unacceptable is the only way you can put it. And it's kind of like I know it's just a small sample size with this one match in particular against Vegas, but like really like Vancouver's thing since Neptune has been in the roster, they've been really good at hardpoint, and they win both hardpoints against Vegas, who just Vegas hasn't been a good hardpoint team this year, and they haven't been a great team in general, but really like whether it was the All Saudi roster. I guess when Pred, Priest, and Arcides first came into the roster, they did find some moderate success in hardpoint compared to the previous roster, which found absolutely no success on hardpoint. But still, I would think like it's a team that you expect Vancouver to win the other modes in outside of hardpoint, which they've been so good in against every team, let alone a team like Vegas that's had their struggles in the mode this year. So the fact that they get Neslo'd by Vegas is just it's I guess really concerning has to be the best one word to describe it, because like that they're losing to a team that's one of the worst teams in CDL history. And even if you don't want to go that far, it's just they lost to a team that's not at champs, and now they're going into champs. They are playing teams that objectively had better seasons than the team they most recently lost to. So it's definitely got to be concerning for Vancouver. I do think they've shown what they're capable of this year. They have the coaching staff with Rambo there to try and put in the work and fix any issues they've been having behind scenes potentially. So I'm not totally writing out Vancouver just yet, but I mean they're going to be tested right away because it is champs. Only 8 teams there, the best of the best this season. And they're going to be tested right away at champs with a matchup against Miami, who we're just talking very highly of. And we were just talking about Miami and how good they are at search. And that's if Vancouver's losing 2 searches to Vegas, Miami's got to be looking at this like we just got to win 1 respawn and we're chilling, right? If you win, if Miami like wins 2 respawns, they're like, yeah, series is over. It doesn't even have to go to a game 5. So, I don't know. It's definitely just. Oh, I did not expect to be having this conversation about Vancouver heading into Major 4, even with that first round matchup against LAT. Definitely, still thought they could have made a run to the finals, but I will be interested to see how they respond. I guess we're getting ahead here of the champs bracket, but if the teams just drop down to like they do in the first round of the majors here, if Vancouver loses to Miami and then LAT Boston is the other matchup in their like quadrant there of the top bracket, if LAT beats Boston, we have Vancouver versus Boston for, in the first round of the losers bracket. That's a matchup where I'm sitting here like, I still would pick Vancouver right now just because both of these teams. I mean, I've been picking against Boston for a while now, but that's besides the point. I mean, that's like it feels like similar narrative wise to Vancouver dropping down to play Vegas last event, where I'm saying like, yeah, they got a favorable matchup even if they lose round 1 of winners and they can go on a loser bracket run, but like I don't know if I have the same amount of confidence now that they had that same opportunity at Major 4 and they really just didn't take advantage of that matchup there in the loser bracket. So I don't know what's going to happen here for Vancouver. My bigger thing overall for Vancouver, and really, I guess this doesn't necessarily matter a ton for our listeners, but it will if they are involved in like the fan voting for any of the awards and stuff. I just when we're considering Neptune in particular, or just any of the Vancouver guys for like the all-star teams and whatnot. I don't think just this one hiccup at Major Four, which it is a big hiccup. There's no way around that. I don't think that should take away from the impact that Neptune had on this Vancouver team and literally how he completely revitalized Vancouver as a team and just completely changed their season after joining the team following Major One. So I still think, we'll inevitably talk about this more, but I still think we've outlined like the all stars and whatnot, and especially for SMGs. I think it's pretty clear cut that it's in no particular order. Most likely Simp, Hydra, uh, the first team all stars SMGs, and then Jodeci's Neptune as the second team all stars. But now I feel like with that recency bias, it's the same thing we talked about with Scrap. He's got the 2 tournament wins, the last 2 tournament wins, and the 2 individual MVPs. I feel like because those 2 wins came so recently to when this voting will be happening, that recency bias might play to his advantage. I think, on the other hand, this top 12 finish could like sort of sway some people to not vote in favor of Neptune being a potential all-star, and I think that would just be something I can't get on board with.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. If you are voting on these all-star teams, just look at it from the totality of this season and kind of take the timing out of it. And maybe you think Simp or Celium or one of the phase guys that's the MVP, and you don't think that Scrap is, or vice versa. Just look at it from, okay, they each have 2 major wins. They, MVP, the count, obviously Scrap has 2. These other guys have 1. Take it just as the count and not like, when did they do this? Was this 4 months ago versus 4 days ago? Like, don't take it like that, because, and I think you have to look at what Vancouver was before Neptune and what they were after. And he has the greatest, if you had like in terms of like actual most valuable, because LAT is like this incredible super team. Like, it's kind of hard to say like, well, this guy is like the most valuable because, if you think Scrap, for example, is the most valuable, you can make a great argument still that Hydra is the most valuable because look how great he is and look how, especially when he elevates his game, how much better LAT is as a result. The best case for value really is the before and after. And you don't get that with everybody because not everybody comes into a roster mid-season, but Neptune did. And now you can look at him and say, well, this is Vancouver. They were kind of dead on arrival to begin the season. And then afterwards were these contenders, at least for a little bit. Obviously the end of the season was not great, but if you said post Neptune that they would have a top 12 finish and then 2 grand finals appearances at majors, I think you would take that regardless of the order in which it came. So yeah, obviously don't really consider the timing on that. But back to Vancouver, the hard point, I mean, just in general, let's think about this. That LAT series was as dominant of a series that I can remember Vancouver and LAT having. LAT has swept them a few times. They even swept them in the grand finals. Those maps in general have been very, very close, and Vancouver's been competitive in a lot of those maps. It was not competitive whatsoever, and that's alarming. Like, if LAT and Atlanta have that kind of series where, like, LAT just runs away or Atlanta runs away, and it's a 3-0 sweep, it's a DoorDash special, whatever you want to say, that would be concerning for Vancouver combined with the subsequent loss to Vegas. That's bad news. That is not anything that I want. Like, they're going to be so hard to pick in the pick'em, to be honest, because of this. Like, this is kind of the same deal with Toronto going into this. Like, you lose to OpTic. Like, I don't know how good OpTic is. I don't know, like, what to think of Toronto going into this. You said, I don't know what to think of OpTic going into this. Like, if they played any other team than Toronto, I wouldn't know who to pick. Vancouver, I feel the exact same way. Like, they play a very, very good team right now. Miami has been incredible really recently. Vancouver, like that is, man, that's gonna suck. Like I kind of don't want to pick that match at all now because I think it would have been a pretty simple. I'll go with Vancouver, but I can definitely see Miami. That probably would have been my exact wording if this happened pre Major Four. Now it feels like completely different with how I think about that matchup. Granted, if they do lose and they drop down to Boston, they've been very dominant against the Breach this season. I think they're 4-0 with Neptune. And but still, Boston is Boston, and they've had these moments. And I should mention the Breach, their best game mode is hardpoint. So when, granted, they're not nearly as good in hardpoint as Vancouver is, or
Sure,
I guess
yeah.
was at one point. But Boston, that's still like their bread and butter. Like they usually, if they're going to win a series, it's probably going to be through hardpoint. And that should be scary for this current iteration of Vancouver and its fans. So I'm very concerned about the Surge going into champs. Granted, they have several weeks to figure it out. I'm sure Rambo will be on those guys about improving over the next month or so. But man, that's a really bad finish to a otherwise incredible regular season for the Vancouver Surge. Any other team that you wanted to hit on before we get out of here?
I mean, we've kind of talked about Toronto in a roundabout way. Is there anything you want to talk about with them?
Do you think they regret not signing Mercules?
That's a good question.
I know people were saying it because obviously they played OpTic round one. They lose back-to-back matches to them. Toronto ends up finishing they finished top 6. So not a great performance, worse than they did with Mercules at Major 3. Do you think, if they're sitting back and you would give them some truth serum, maybe a little liqueur, maybe they feel like they're opening up to us, do you think they would actually say, yeah, we do feel like we probably should have signed Mercules?
I think the percentage chance of them saying truthfully they have absolutely no regrets about it is 0%. I think there has to be at least some part of them that, sees the way it's played out, especially just because they've lost to OpTic twice since the decision came through. From a organizational standpoint in terms of overactive media and Toronto Ultra, whatever, I can't give an honest answer there just because we don't know that whole. I outlined it at that time. We don't know the contract situation. We don't know if there was any buyout involved for OpTic. Like if OpTic had to give Toronto any amount of money, that might lessen the blow of these losses a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think I saw a clip of Aches talking about it on the flank, and it's kind of paraphrasing here, but it was basically you had the potential to make just a very easy roster decision in terms of the team played really well with Mercules. If they decided to keep him in the roster and keep Beans on the bench, I don't think a lot of people would have questioned it just because of what we saw at Major 3. And it's not like I like Beans. I think he's a funny guy. I think he's played pretty well this year, but it's not it's not like Scump had visa issues and Mercules is replacing Scump, right? It's not like a face of the franchise player being even if it was Joe Deceives or Kleenex. It's not a player of that super caliber where it's we have to get him back in the roster, no questions asked. I think it's just the only part of this that, again, from an organizational standpoint, that really is outside of any potential money exchanging hands either, is just the way Toronto in particular has conducted business over these last few off seasons, where they allow the players to explore their options and stuff. It's not likely that Toronto was looking at Mercules as this potential building block for future rosters. I could be completely off in saying that, but just again, based on them letting guys like Insight and Kleenex continually being restricted free agents, testing the market, and then coming back, it's most likely that they weren't like thinking ahead when they were considering the roster move and thinking like, okay, Mercules can be on our roster for the next 2 years, basically. And I mean, end of the day, we don't know if that's. I mean, it feels like that's the vibe with OpTic right now. But with OpTic being OpTic, things could change very quickly. And I guess a good example of that, even uh, someone like Envoy, when Envoy was being called the Dark Prince or whatever, and he was
Yeah.
like the prince to Scump's king or whatever, it felt like Envoy was that next guy up when Scump inevitably retired. And then someone like Ghosty even got his shot on OpTic. It felt like he might stick around too. Um, so I don't really know what the future holds for Mercules. It feels like to me, I mean, again, I've said it every time we've talked about OpTic's roster this year. My vibe in terms of what I think the team is going to do has been completely off.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, it feels like for me, like Mercules could be a part of OpTic beyond this season. And I think that's pretty cool, especially just given his whole story, how this came to be. Like, you know, literally, like, if Beans doesn't have visa issues, this kid's most likely not even in the CDL right now, let alone on OpTic. So it is a weird situation. I definitely I'm glad you brought this question up, and it's a good way to you know, kind of look at Toronto right now, because I mean, at least for the rest of this season, like that Beams and Mercules are just going to be intertwined in comparisons and whatnot based on how they play the rest of the year. And it could be one of those things where they're compared for like the rest of their careers, really, if they, you know, they keep battling it out for a couple more years. It could always be that the sort of the Wally Pip thing where he got replaced by Lou Gehrig, I believe, or was it DiMaggio? I don't remember. I should know that, but
It was
I'm
Gehrig.
tired. But yeah, so I mean, that's a drastic example, but yeah, no, I think that was I kind of rambled for a bit there, so I'm gonna give you a chance to answer your own question.
I just love that you said Wally Pip when I was thinking of Luca and Trae Young, like, because that really shows like where our focuses are. I was actually trying to think of a traditional sports example, and I know this is like a really extreme example, but like when Brady came in for Drew Bledsoe, and obviously Drew Bledsoe was injured, like there was that, like the old traditional person would say you can't lose your starting spot due to injury. And in kind of a similar vein, you know, it would suck for Beans, and it would be like quote unquote unfair for Beans to lose his starting spot because of something he did not have any control over. This was not his individual play. This was him not being able to get into the country. So that is a completely different thing. At the same point, though, life is not fair, and this is a competitive environment, and at the end of the day, it is about winning. So, you know, Drew Bledsoe did not come back to the New England Patriots and start again. He was traded, I think, to Buffalo. And, you know, that's no offense to Drew Bledsoe, was a good quarterback. Jimmy Garoppolo, you know, he gets hurt. Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant, comes in. He has, people are like, what the hell is this guy doing? And that's, you know, the rest is history. Now he's getting paid $255 million.
$50 million a year for the next 5.
I don't know if Mercules is getting that contract, but I'm sure the OpTic paychecks are nice. I think if the the Toronto GM is given truth serum, I think he's like, yeah, man, like I wish we would have done this. You know, if we could have got it done, if it was possible, we should have got it done. And it shouldn't have been a hesitation in our minds for us to replace Beans with Mercules. And that's, again, not anything to do with Beans. It's just we saw what you can do with Mercules on absolutely zero practice. Like, this is a guy just kind of showing up to the event and helping you get top 4 at an event. I think we should also note, like, they finished top 6 at this event, but they beat Carolina in Game 5. Carolina has been atrocious over the past month and a half, and they beat LAG, who they won one at least land match this season, maybe 2 land matches this season. They're not much better than Vegas. So they beat them, and then they lost to LAT. Granted, it was like a pretty competitive series all things considered, but still like top 6 or worse placing than they got with Mercules. I said it at the time that, we were talking about like what will they do? They didn't have a lot of time like in between Major 3 and the Major 4 qualifiers to make that decision. I wonder if that had anything to do with it as well. Like if they had another week or two, does anything change for Toronto, or do they always stick with Beans? I don't know. I would have done it. I think you would have done it, or we were definitely, if we were running the Ultra, we would have been throwing the bags, probably literally and figuratively at Mercules to keep him. It didn't work out. I think it's, probably gonna doom them in terms of like being a contender, because I think with Mercules they probably could have contended for a championship this season. I don't really see that at champs this year, but who knows? It's a weird world we live in. But yeah, Toronto finishes top 6 here. They finished, I think, 3rd in the standings, if I'm not mistaken, in the final standings, because they were really consistent all year round, which was probably the argument to keep Beans in general was, hey, like we've done pretty well on land. We've done pretty well online. They had a 65% win percentage this season, 3rd highest in the league, 57% map win percentage. They paced Vancouver for 3rd place by 40 points. It wasn't particularly close. They have been pretty competitive with LAT and Atlanta at various points in the season. They reached 30 wins this season, so there's a lot of positives. But really what it comes down to is kind of like how high is your ceiling, and do you believe you can win a championship at the end of the season? We'll see how that works out for Toronto. I don't think there's really anything else that we really need to get to today. I was looking at the teams and I'm like, we'll probably have a little bit of time to talk about Vegas and LAG and C9 and even Minnesota, who obviously came up short in qualifying for champs. Even though I think they gave a pretty good run. If they were a little more consistent, they won. I don't know how many game 5s they lost this season, but man, that's probably the biggest point that they could probably look at and say, if we won half of those, we might have actually qualified for champs, because they came 35 points away from Boston. So that's, if they get 4 more wins, I would imagine they had at least 8 game 5 losses this season, which is truly incredible. So they probably could have snuck into champs had those things went right for them. But that's kind of how it goes. Anything else you want to talk about before we get out of here?
I think we're good.
All right, so we're about an hour in. We appreciate you guys tuning in on the weekend or whenever you're listening to this podcast. We will be back at some point in the middle of the week. I do want to check in and do the tier lists and power rankings, because it's been a while since we did them, and they have certainly changed, I would imagine. With granted, 4 teams are not contenders, and they will be in the bottom tier or 2 at the end of the season, but I do want to do the tier list before we get to champs, so we can actually see where we rank these teams ahead of the final event of the season. So we'll do that over the next week or two. We'll also talk about the all-star teams over the next week or two. I know you kind of gave out like what you're thinking right now, but I think we'll put pen to paper, or I guess keystroke to a laptop or whatever over the next week or two as well. But we appreciate you guys tuning in, listening, watching, whatever you're doing here on your Saturday or Sunday night. We will be back at some point next week to talk about maybe some more of these teams. I don't know if there will be any roster mania stuff. We might hear players that are going to be restricted free agents coming up, just because players like to get out early on that, try to get a little buzz going for them. So we'll talk about that. We will start talking about the major, or talk more about champs as we get to that, and then we'll eventually do our preview show, which is always a really fun show. It feels like really important, obviously, because of how champs is and how there are only 8 teams, and how it is kind of a make or break tournament in terms of legacies and in terms of history making performances. So We will eventually talk about that. But yeah, we'll be back. Please follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers. The podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. Please subscribe, like, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I think we're at 233 subscribers, 34 maybe. Yeah, we appreciate you very much. And I am kind of getting warm in here. It has been cold all day, and it, for some reason, has gotten warm at night. So I think global warming is screwing me over right now. So I am going to send it over to Bink. And yeah, take it over, Bink.
Yeah, short and sweet this time. Thanks as always for all your support. Really appreciate it. We're gonna try and fill these next couple weeks and lead up to champs with as much stuff as we can, but schedule will obviously be in flux just because they're, you know, really, like Preston said, there isn't a ton to talk about outside any surprising roster news or, you know, retirements or uh, anything like that. And outside of that, it's really just going to be talking about stuff that we come up with on our own. So, um, hope you've enjoyed our coverage this year and stick with us heading into champs here. Well, we will be live at some point, just talking about whatever we can. So, hope you tune in then. And yeah, other than that, thanks as always. And remember to send the chow.